Today, I'm honored to speak with Humanist International's Chief Executive Officer, Gary McLelland, who joined Humanist International in 2017 after serving as head of communications and public affairs at Humanist Society of Scotland since 2013. He's held roles on the boards of the European Humanist Federation and the Scottish Joint Committee on Religious and Moral Education. Gary holds a BSc in psychology and a diploma in childhood and youth studies and a master's degree in human rights law with focus on blasphemy laws in international human rights legal systems. We're here to discuss the Freedom of Thought Report, Humanist International's flagship review and rating of countries around the world when it comes to the human rights and treatment of humanists, atheists, and the non-religious. This monumental task involves the research and feedback of humanist groups in each country. The Canadian section of this year's report has been updated with the help of Humanist Canada, Humanist Ottawa, Halton Peel Humanist Community, Humanist Association of Toronto, l'Association Humaniste de Québec, and Secular Connection Séculaire. Gary and I will be touching on a wide range of human rights and freedoms that cascade from this worldwide review, including freedom of expression, religious privilege, freedom of religion or belief, the trend in global populism, and the threat to democracy. So, hello, Gary McLelland. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks, Robert. How are you?
Just great. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the Freedom of Thought Report 2023, which was released in December of 2023, and just generally cover how freedom of thought as a human right is important to humanists and atheists worldwide. Could you just give us just an introduction to what is the Freedom of Thought Report?
Sure. So the Freedom of Thought Report, as you say, is a report which Humanists International has been running. It's now in its 12th edition, so we've been doing it for the past 12 years. And what we do is essentially we do a review of every country in the world, and we assess the legal and policy situation as it affects the human rights, particularly of atheists, humanists, and other non-religious people. So it's very much based on international human rights framework. So, as a sort of general introduction to people who might not be terribly familiar with that, the main human rights document, which we refer to as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was sort of promulgated in 1948, coming on the back of the World War II and the atrocities that were committed against people during that. And so this declaration is a long document which sets out many positive rights which individuals can enforce against their states. And Article 18 of that convention is the one that is the primary focus of this report. So Article 18 is we often reduce it to freedom of religion or belief, but the actual full text of that is a bit more expansive. So it's actually what the text actually says is everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief. I think we can substitute in their religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest their religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So in actual fact, when we see this right reduced down to, as it is often in the United States, religious freedom, that can be quite a problematic reduction of that human right. So I think it's just important to put a marker there that the original drafting of this declaration was much more expansive than simply religious freedom. So anyway, that's the main part of the International Human Rights Code that we're focused on in this report. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is where it gets a bit technical, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights isn't a law. There's no legislation in the world that this human right is enforced by. There's no, obviously, the UN don't have a way of enforcing that. So the way that most people have access to these human rights is through something that we call incorporation. And that's where these human rights are incorporated into national law at the state level, and therefore that's how most people are able to access human rights. So I believe this was done in Canada in the 1970s through incorporation of a subsidiary treaty called the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
That's right.
But we're probably getting a bit too much into the weeds on international human rights law here.
Well, no, it's important, I think, for people to realize that Canada has a legal responsibility,
That's right.
right? And
That's right.
though the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is broad and expansive, there is this legal requirement, and I think what Canadians often think is that the buck stops in Canada, but in fact, it goes beyond that.
That's right. That's right. And I think the way to think about it is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is it's a moral document. It sets out with great moral and political force the aspirations of the post-war international rights-based system, and the ICCPR, which is a more detailed document, a treaty, is the document which actually enforces that. And the Canadian Parliament chose voluntarily to incorporate that into national Canadian law so that Canadian citizens can enforce their rights against the Canadian government, but as you say, as part of this international system to which almost all states have now, voluntarily committed themselves. So yes, that's how the international system in practice affects individuals. And of course, with human rights, it's important to say that when we talk about legal human rights, we're talking about the legal human rights of groups and individuals against the government. So that's that's how these human rights become sort of actionable. But for the purposes of this report, we're mainly focused, not exclusively, but we're mainly focused on Article 18, which, as we summarise, is the right to freedom of religion or belief. And I think that's just a sort of important marker to put down there. So this report, originally we did the first edition of it, which would have been about 12 years ago, was focused on quite a narrow range of countries. We partnered with the American Humanist Association and the US State Department to do a kind of narrowly focused report on a selection of countries. And over the years, we've expanded that to now be a completely online report, which covers every single country in the world. Now, it's our ambition to update all of those entries as regularly as possible, but due to resource constraints and the kind of increasing focus of the report, or the increasing attention that the report gets, and therefore the need to be much more diligent and detailed in the research that we do, we've had to put that onto a sort of rolling program. So we now aim to update every country between every 3 and 5 years, which is obviously less than ideal, but if any of your listeners or viewers know any rich benefactors that would like to help us increase the resources available, then I'm always available to talk.
Yes, yeah. It does really sound like a really Herculean task at that, because you're trying to cover the world, even if spreading out across multiple years. It's an enormous undertaking. Essentially, the report is a survey, right?
That's right. So the way that the research is conducted, I mean, I think actually last year my colleague Emma did a workshop with several of you and your colleagues, I think, in Canada to look
Yes.
at updating the Canadian entry. Now, I wasn't at that, but I can imagine the discussion and the debate that sparked around the interpretation of legislation and so on. So if you can imagine timesing that by 190, and then you bring into consideration the fact that, there are countries in the world, actually Canada's one of them, whose legislation is published in multiple official languages. You have many countries for which there isn't widespread use of English. And then one of the interesting things as well is in many countries, our report primarily focuses on law and policy, and that kind of hard indicators like that. So essentially, this report is something that can be done by a desk-based researcher. It's not something that requires social research to go out and speak to people on the street and so on. Now, one of the difficulties with that is we make a massive assumption here that the law and policy is actually implemented and followed.
Yes.
And of course, we know in many countries in the world that that's not the case, that legislation and policy says one thing, but the experience and practice and reality is a different thing. So that's definitely one of the weaknesses of the report. But yeah, so the task of updating all of these countries in the world is huge, and we have to do it very carefully because Humanist International in general, one of the main strengths we have in our toolbox is our reputation. We've been around for 72 years. We're one of the oldest human rights organizations in the world. And people generally, when we speak about issues, trust us because they know that we have a balanced, thoughtful, and sort of uh, generally well-founded view on the issues that we campaign on. So any errors or misjudgments in this report could really damage that important reputation. So it's a huge job of work.
Yes. Just to back up for a moment, though, with respect to freedom of thought, religion, and belief, I think some people may initially think that they stop at the word religion, that is a freedom of religion, and then they don't go on to that. And so the report talks about a more broader definition of freedom of religion or belief, and therefore brings it into scope for non-believers, atheists, and humanists. Could you talk a little bit about why this has to do with humanists at
Sure.
all?
Sure. So there's maybe a philosophical point in here which I'm going to very directly try and dodge,
Okay.
which is the definition of, are atheists, is atheism a belief that should be within the ambit of protection for this Article 18? Now, the short answer is yes, and let's move on. But obviously there is a longer, I think, discussion which has been sort of happening in the background about whether or not atheism, humanism, etc., is a belief or a philosophical commitment, or whether it's simply a lack of that belief and so on. Now, the United Nations has addressed this point directly. So there's a thing called General Comment 22, which people can Google if they're interested. And in that general comment, the Human Rights Committee have said that they interpret Article 18 to be very clearly focused on the protection of obviously religious believers and many others, but also of atheists, humanists, and other non-religious people. So the human rights afforded under Article 18 they are legally accessible for people who are atheists, people who are what do you call it, apostates and so on.
Right.
So I think that the separate discussion about the sort of hermeneutics of the word belief and so on is maybe an interesting one, but for the lawyers and for the legal human rights case, it's very clear that this human right is one that we as non-believers, as humanists and atheists, as splitters and heretics and
Yes.
whatever you want to call it, we can afford ourselves protection by this
Right.
Article 18.
I would just put a point on that, which has to do with the fact that it's not splitting hairs. In terms of it having practical implications. During the Afghan relief initiatives, the legislation within Canada referred to victims of religious discrimination, and when it worded that way, excludes freedom of religion or belief, that is to say, those who are facing religious discrimination because of their non-belief. And
Mm-hmm.
so we had to pursue a clarification with respect to that to ensure that humanitarian aid could go and be extended to those who are not members of any religion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think there's this principle, international law of harmonization. So you'll see in many countries around the world, there's been a process of harmonization by which anything in the past which referred to religion, religious freedom, etc., has now been reinterpreted by courts and public authorities to include or belief or non-belief, etc. So I think, but it's an important point I think for us to make is that in discussions with government or other agencies or anybody, when you're talking about this issue, it's really, really important to use the terminology freedom of religion or belief.
Or belief.
And I know that again, there's a discussion. I think some people don't like to see themselves under that umbrella of belief. But I think that the important thing to remember is that belief doesn't necessarily mean, well, in this case, it doesn't obviously mean a religious belief or a supernatural belief. It can be the belief in human progress, in humanism, and natural, ways of interpreting and living your life. So yeah, so I think it's really important in any meeting I'm in. I'm very, very keen to point out that the use of the term freedom of religion or belief, FORB, is a much more inclusive and progressive way of talking about this issue rather than religious freedom, because then you very often see, and this is very common with your neighbours to the south, I have to say, is that when you talk about religious freedom, it very quickly I think, falls into a competing rights argument of, well, you have LGBT rights here and religious freedom here, so who gets to go first and how does
Yes.
this? Whereas in actual fact, if I think if you take a more thoughtful approach to human rights, you can see that we all have human rights. Sometimes those are in conflict. The rights of an individual versus the rights of the group will sometimes come into conflict, and that's resolved by quiet discussion, reasoned debate, empathy, and so on. It's not, where one right gets to trump the other. It's about trying to embrace as much human rights for as many people as possible with,
Yes.
so yeah.
This relates to, I don't want to harp on this too much, but this relates to another issue that we're facing here in Canada with, related to medical assistance in dying, and
Mm,
the term used often within that discussion has to do with freedom of conscience. That is to say, medical doctors who want to sort of opt out because they want to express their freedom of conscience. So that's something slightly different than freedom of religion or belief, right?
Yes, well, I mean, the Article 18 does refer to conscience, so it talks about everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So it is related. We don't, in our report, focus too much on that issue, but it is an important issue to talk about. I don't remember the actual figures offhand, but I know from our colleagues in Italy that the number of doctors who have chose to exercise their freedom of conscience against performing abortion means that essentially in vast swathes of Italy, access to abortion is essentially not possible, not because it's illegal, but simply because of the vast number of medical care people who have chosen not to participate in it. And
Mhm.
of course, that then becomes an issue of, okay, well, maybe, and then you have an issue between group rights and individual rights. It may be the case that medical staff should have this right to opt out, but at the same time, the people who need to access this abortion care have the right to access it. So how do you balance those rights? And I think it's at that point when you have to have a difficult discussion about, something's got to give in that situation, and there's got to be some compromise made.
Okay. Very interesting. So, let's just talk a little bit more about the detailed aspect of the rating system
Hmm.
with respect to the Freedom of the Thought report. There's a system of rating countries worldwide. Can you talk about the rating categories in the system?
That's right. So we break down our assessment of the different laws and policies in each country according to four different strands. So those are number one, constitution and government. Number two, education and children's rights. Number three, family, community, society, and religious courts and tribunals. And the fourth and last one, freedom of expression and advocacy of humanist values. So within each of those strands, we then have what we call boundary conditions. So under each of those four categories, we have a number of indicators that to us would then score a particular number. So, for example, within the constitution and government, you might have something, you might have it being an officially religious country. Like Iran, for example, would be an officially Islamic country, and that would therefore limit, obviously, the freedom of religion or belief of all the citizens within it. But then you might have a situation like affects Canada or where I live in the United Kingdom, where there is preferential treatment given to one religion, or indeed, as it happens in England, one in church, where we have an established church. So within each of those thematic areas, there is these boundary conditions, as we call them. So basically, what we do is based on the research from our volunteers in different countries around the world, and also research done by our sort of desk officers. They apply these boundary conditions, and essentially, the most severe boundary condition that we find within each of the areas becomes that score for that country. And then we sum up all of those scores and give each country a score out of, well, it's a sort of additive score that they get. And then we assign them a traffic light system. So if you go into the Freedom of Thought Report website, which
Yes.
is fot.humanists.international, you can see a map of every country in the world where we've totalized these boundary conditions and given it a sort of red, green, amber score.
Right. Yeah, there are different levels in terms once the rating is done by each of those categories, and you have
That's right.
severe, systemic, mostly satisfactory,
That's right.
no rating, free and equal, that type of thing. You have basically three or four levels.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, within the each of the four strands, the actual uh, severity score sort of goes down from grave violations, which is the worst, severe discrimination, systemic discrimination, mostly satisfactory, free and equal. And then we also have, you'll see some countries and some ratings might have a sort of grey score, and that's just simply where we're unable to gather information to make a determination about what's happening in that country.
Mhm. Of those levels, the one there are certain egregious situations of human rights worldwide, and we can talk about that in a moment. But one of the things I wanted to focus on, because it affects the Canadians' situation, has to do with systemic discrimination, and the definition of that, because we're affected by that. Now, the report suggests that religious privilege is not represents kind of a form of discrimination, and that there are preferential treatment of one religion over another, or of religions in general over a non-belief. And so, could you talk a little bit about the concept of religious privilege as a discrimination, and how this impacts human rights?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, that's a good question. So I can talk a little bit about the situation in the UK because it's one I'm more familiar with. But in the UK, we have in England, the Church of England, which is established by law as the national church. Our head of state, who's also the head of state of Canada, is the head of that church. And, for example, every day in our parliament, MPs are, there's a chaplain from the Church of England in the parliament, and they are required to participate in Christian prayers at the start of the parliamentary session. So this would be examples of religious privilege where it's not necessarily something to do with the function and executive authority of the government, and it doesn't necessarily equate to a direct discrimination against individual humanists or atheists. But what it is it's a reinforcement by the state machinery and by the trappings of the state that one religious system, one belief system is above all the rest. So that would be what we would mean by, or an example of what we would mean by religious privilege. It would be just the sense that um, the Christian, in the example of the UK, the Christian church and the Church of England in particular is set above the rest of the, you know, marketplace of religion and belief ideas and so on. And again, I mean, you may have seen that last year in the United Kingdom with the coronation of King Charles as
Yes,
head of
very.
state of the UK
Yeah, it was
is a
very.
Christian service.
Yes, it was very
It
religious.
takes, yes, yeah. I mean, it's a Anglican mass. It's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
clearly a Christian service. So these would be things to do with religious privilege.
Wow. And so then, by that definition, then, as religious privilege, it constitutes a religious discrimination, and is would be then a legal violation of the ICCPR, at the UK or Canada, as signatory to that covenant, right? And so therefore would
Well,
be illegal, considered illegal from an international perspective.
that's a more difficult thing to say, I think. The this has to do with the kind of technical aspects of human rights law. So, in there is no court to which an individual can apply for redress at the United Nations. What you can do through the way that your state laws are interpreted or implemented, you can take actions against the national government for its implementation of human rights. Now, I don't know whether the establishment of the Church of England, I don't know a court in which you could prosecute that as a violation of Article 18. I
Right?
don't know what the outcome would be. So I think it's more difficult to say that it's a breach of human rights. I think what we would say is in our interpretation or in our view of how Article 18 should be implemented and how a proper approach to freedom of religion or belief should be realised, that it is clearly in conflict with that principle and that objective. I think it would be more difficult to make a determination certainly for me as not a lawyer,
Yes.
about whether that would, what the courts in the UK or in other countries would say about that if it was brought before them.
Hmm.
But I know, well, here's an area in which I know a little bit more about. Um, in the UK and in Scotland in particular, which is where I am from and live, we have segregated schooling. So we have Catholic state-funded schools, and then we have what are called non-denominational state-funded schools, which commonly are referred to as Protestant because they are non-denominationally Christian. And you may know a little bit about the sectarian history of,
Yes.
particularly in Glasgow where I live, so you can understand a little bit about that. Now, I believe that that is a contravention of various human rights principles, but the interesting thing is when the UK created the Equality Act in 2010, they wrote into that legislation exemptions for religious schools so that
Ah,
it couldn't be used to challenge the existence of Catholic schools, or, for example, the fact that teachers in Catholic schools in Scotland require to be approved by the Catholic Church, and
yes.
that there is evidence that the Catholic Church will not approve, for example, or there has been be careful what I say here. There has been claims in the past that the Catholic Church will not approve teachers in Catholic schools who are known to be gay.
Oh, wow. Yes.
So there has been, or indeed not Catholic. So my view would be that's clearly a breach of human rights in principle. But the difficulty is because of the way these laws are often implemented, they specifically exclude some of these discriminatory practices from legal challenge. So it gets very messy when you try to sort of implement or take action on these things, which is why our report doesn't really, the Freedom of Thought report has never made recommendations, so we don't get involved in direct advocacy at the state level. I think what we see this report as being is a tool for national organisations or other advocacy groups to use as the basis of advocacy.
Okay, I was going to talk about that later, but perhaps we should talk about it here in terms of use of the report in an advocacy context. Yes, you're right that the report that doesn't have specific recommendations, and it falls to each individual country to use the freedom of thought report in an advocacy context to address problems that could exist. Could you talk a little bit about how the freedom of thought report could be used in that way?
Definitely. So one of the things that we can do as well, and we've been trying to publicize this more, is we can make available, we have the different files. I don't know how it works, but we can make, for example, a Canadian version of the report where we edit the cover and make it, more focused on Canada or other countries. Translate it into French. If we can do all these different things to make the report a tool which is much more usable for a national or local group, which is something you can just ask us to do that, and we can do that. So that's one thing. I think what we see around the world is useful ways of using the report is that, for example, in the Netherlands, in Norway, the United Kingdom, and many countries around the world, I think in Barbados as well, they host a national launch of the report. So we make available a draft press release, notes on the report. Of course, myself and Emma are always available to help as well. But hosting a launch event in, for example, the Canadian Parliament or the provincial parliaments or other places around the world can be a really, really key thing. And that's the other thing we can do. We can edit the report to put on like other people's logos and things. The
Yes.
way that we think of the report is it's not like a Humanist International report. It's a report which is done by the network of humanist organizations around the world, and we want to see it as being kind of equally owned by all of us. So yeah, so hosting a launch event. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, they host a launch event with one of the cross-party groups of humanists. So this is members of Parliament from all different political parties will come together in one of the meeting rooms in Westminster and have a launch event and talk about the report. They might even invite one of the ministers from the government to give a response on how they're going to answer some of the points raised. And I think it's at that point where the research in the report can be used by the national organisations to make a point at, look, I'm just going to talk generally here, but look at the situation in Canada with religious schools and look how much of an outlier this is with other Western democracies or other, whatever the point is you want to make, and
Right.
use it as a tool to spur on the conversation for change.
Mhm. Yes, we there certainly is a potential there in terms of the discussion, and it does require humanists within each country and across Canada specifically to be up to speed with respect to how this report can be used to leverage against other documents as well. Human rights is handled both at the federal and the provincial levels for various aspects of rights, always in relation to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, but really never really paying attention to it in relation to requirements and responsibilities on it at an international scale.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's that's an important aspect of it as well. Um,
Definitely.
of the I don't know that we have a lot of time to go through each of the individual categories, but the one category of the four that I just want to touch on a little briefly is freedom of expression, advocacy for humanist values, which is really more humanist specific. That really more touches very. I mean, all of it touches on humanism, but that one is particular. In Canada, we don't have we used to have blasphemy laws and legislation, but that has been set aside now for in favor of um, hate legislation and expressions of hate. Now, the definitions of that in Canada are broadly defined in terms of freedom of expression and humanist values. Could you talk a little bit about what that category is and where that fits in terms of humanism worldwide in that area? I mean, it's a broad question.
Sure. So thinking about this category, some of the things you've already mentioned blasphemy laws. So that would obviously be, a big, grave violation of that core of that strand. The idea that criticizing or yeah, being critical of religion or even just promoting humanist ideas in some countries can be seen as blasphemous or a challenge to religious authority, and in many countries is punishable by death, at least in theory, if not in practice. So that would clearly be something that would be a grave violation of that freedom of expression and advocacy of humanist values. Um, of course, I think the other thing to remind is humanist values, obviously, one of the issues which or one of the core parts of humanism is that it's a naturalistic, non-religious, therefore atheistic philosophy. But it's also much
Yes.
more than that. It's about, it's about a confidence in democracy. It's about openness to arts and other natural human values, and also just the belief that the progress and success that we want to see in the world will only be achieved by the human beings that and other animals that live here, and that the expression of those ideas of democracy and equality and arts and culture, that is controversial or outlawed in many countries around the world. So it's important to remember that it's not just the religious aspect. It's much more. There's many more ideas within humanism which states find challenging.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, so there are many countries in the world where it's simply illegal and not possible to identify as a humanist,
Mhm.
where citizenship is linked directly to a religious identity. So I think in those contexts, that's one of some of the issues that we're focused on is the expression of these um, broader humanist principles, not just about religion.
Mhm.
And it's been said many times before, but and it's been said by many in the human rights world that that humanists can often be the canaries in the coal mine. You find, and it's true of all minorities. It's not something specific to humanists, but when you see the mistreatment of minorities, is very often a sign that the human rights situation for everybody in a state is going to be pretty bad. And
Yeah.
again, because of the humanist philosophy being so connected to intellectual freedom, democracy, arts and culture, etc., you very often find that when you look at human rights defenders in a country and you look at, for example, the LGBTI campaigners or
Yes.
the democracy campaigners, you will find a massive overlap with the humanist campaigners. It's the same people that are pushing for freedom and individual flourishing and so on. So there's no surprise that there'll be a massive correlation between human rights offences generally and the scores in the Freedom of Thought report.
Mhm. Well, of course, when you're talking about democratic values and ideals, we're talking about general Enlightenment values. And in terms of democracy and democratic ideals, we're experiencing, certainly in 2024, major challenges to our South and on the concept of democratic ideas and values and being so close. This is we're going to, Canada is already being directly affected by these kinds of challenges. And so, um, uh, you know, this can the Freedom of Thought report help with respect to um, being prepared for these kinds of challenges to humanist values?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we try to every year when we release the report summarize the trends, and I think I've said this in another podcast or in some of my statements, but I've worked at Humanist International now for about 7 years, and prior to that, I worked at the Humanist Society Scotland. So, been kind of involved in the human rights world for, I don't know, say 10 or 15 years. I honestly never thought when I started my career that the defense and promotion of democracy would ever be something close to the top of the to-do list. It's really quite shocking that I think we've lost so much ground on one of these core sort of bedrock principles. So I think reading what's happening in the Freedom of Thought report should really spur on humanists and also all defenders of human rights and like-minded individuals to really dig deep and make the argument for the defense of democracy. I mean, I feel like so much of this feels to me like a cliche, but I guess it's obviously needing to be said again is that like democracy is not the natural state of human human settlements of human existence, and
Mhm.
a quick glance of history will show you how incredibly rare and fragile this way of living is for human
Mhm.
populations. And I think if we want to hold on to it, which
Mhm.
I really hope we all do, it's going to require a massive input of energy to defend it. Because part of the problem is that the enemies of democracy have a lot of material. To argue with, that there are lots and lots and lots of flaws in democracy, and it's very hard work. It's a machine which is not perfect and requires a lot of maintenance and energy to keep going. But again, as the cliche goes, it's the worst system of organizing human behaviors except all the rest. And I think we have to simply, we have to be willing to put in the energy and make the arguments to defend this imperfect system of governance.
Yes, and so the Humanist International Declaration on democracy in the last World Humanist Congress last year was very timely with respect to that because we're going to be needing that going forward in a very practical sense. So that's very useful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think as well, I suppose, we're now in many sort of Western countries, we're what 100 years on from democracy being semi-standard. It depends when you start measuring it, etc. But I think it's maybe worth a lot of us spending a bit of time and sort of re-educating ourselves about some of the principles of democracy, because I think it does become oversimplified over time. The democracy is more than voting. It's something to do with valuing the opinions of your fellow citizens, even the ones you disagree strongly with,
Mhm.
accepting that there is a difference of opinion which can be mediated and being willing to accept some sort of process of arbitration through which you can be neighborly to someone with whom you disagree. It's really important that we find ways to do that. And I share your concern for what's happening in the United States and many other countries where this division, there's an idea that the winner takes all, and you can just rub your opponent's faces in it,
Yeah.
because that's democracy. Democracy is just 50% plus one. But I
Yes.
think for us as humanists, we have to see that there's a cultural and a social element to this,
Mhm.
and I always feel very strongly I don't want to live next to people who hate me. I want to live next to people with whom I may strongly disagree, but at least I have an insight into why they think that way, what their vision is for the country and for their family and so on. So But then again, maybe that's just idealism on my
No,
part.
that's not idealism at all. That's reason and rationality. That's
Hmm.
that's critical
And
thinking
empathy.
and empathy. Exactly, compassion. And these are so like bedrock things for sure. In terms of overall major findings of the 2023 report, there was on the watch list specifically in the 2023 report, we have hotspots related to freedom of thought in Afghanistan, Greece, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Sri Lanka. And Sudan and Uganda. Yeah. Is there any? I mean, there's a lot to cover in terms of that. Is there any kind of highlight strikes you as particularly notable from the major findings of the Freedom of Thought report?
A good question. I mean, I think in general, I think what we can see is very much related to what we're talking about now. The rise in uh, populist rhetoric, which seeks to create an us and them dichotomy. So, I mean, what's happening in India has been happening for a long time, but you can see it really coming up to a fever pitch now. This idea that India, which by the way, let's remind ourselves, the largest democracy in the world, founded as a secular pluralistic democracy with a constitution and legal safeguards for minorities, etc. So that is what the founding people of India, many of which were humanists and rationalists, was originally founded to be. But it's now sort of transmogrified into a Hindu state, and your lack of profession of the Hindu religion translates into literally what's called anti-nationalistic sentiment,
Right.
and you're seen as sort of an enemy within. And in actual fact, I think by far the most victimized group in India, at least according to my colleagues there, is the Muslims. And again, one of the largest population of Muslims in any country in the world, in India, and have been, for well, hundreds of years. Um, are being told that they are no longer citizens of that country through various pieces of legislation. And one of the things that's been quite heartening for me to see is the humanist and rationalist community joining forces across India to campaign in solidarity with the Muslims of India to say, no, this is not a way to treat your fellow citizens. They have a home here, they belong here. So I think in general terms, to say that this idea that you're only belonging to a country, you only have a home here if you sign up to the religious orthodoxy. Again, in Russia, we've seen that. That's not one on the watch list, but the massive shift over the last 30, 40 years from being an anti-religious state to co-opting the Orthodox Church as part of the machinery of oppression for the state,
Mhm.
and using it as a way of enforcing one way of being for citizens. There is one way to be a good citizen, and it's through this religious identification. So, and again, this is standard populist rhetoric, which happens across all countries, but it's one that needs to really strongly be pushed back against. And
Mhm.
and the benefits of having an open, tolerant, pluralistic society where minorities can coexist and commingle needs to be defended.
Mhm. I think that the Indian example is probably one of the clear-cut examples where you have a democracy corroding in favor of a religious ideology.
Yes.
And though that principle is repeated again and again in other countries, and all countries are at risk with this populist approach. One of the elements of that, and one of the threads in that how that corrosion happens, has to do with the fact that there's essentially a moral argument there that you can't be a good person unless you are associated with some kind of religion in favor. So all of this talk about reason and rationality doesn't uh, you know doesn't stand against an argument saying, well, you're a bad person if you're not within this religion. So the idea that idea allows democratic ideals and reason and rationality to take a back seat to that, and hence the corrosion of these democratic ideals. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just what I think. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. I think it's and it's also cynical, I think, is the other thing to point out. I mean, I can't see into people's minds, but I think the co-option and the use of of a religious sort of cloak, if you like,
Yes.
to be the unifying thing, is cynical. You know,
Yes.
it's the use of a powerful social tool to show one way of being, to co-opt that into your populist nationalist rhetoric,
Mhm.
at the exclusion of anybody who disagrees with you. And again, it plays into this idea that the winner takes all. There's no room for discussion, debate, and what do you call it? For finding a common ground. There's one way of being, and you have to smash the opposition and take 100% of the victory. And I think it's a very anti-democratic mindset to think that the point of democracy is simply to win at all costs and implement whatever you think is right, rather than seeing democracy as a way of mediating between different individuals and groups about finding some sort of common consensus on the way forward. And it doesn't have to be meet in the middle. It doesn't have to be rudimentary, 50% this, 50% that, but it has democracy has to go hand in hand with a spirit of openness to criticism, but also an openness to modify your beliefs and objectives based on the debate and the discussion which happens. And the use of religion as a kind of totalizing end to that discussion and that mediation, I think, is a very anti-democratic instinct within people.
Certainly, that's certainly encapsulates small L liberal Enlightenment values, and that I hesitate to use that word because it means different things in different countries and different to different people. But you're talking about essentially those kinds of values which value open-mindedness and willing to dialogue, discuss, and achieve a broader consensus and a broader agreement for the
Yes.
well-being of the most number of people.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, democracy requires in those people who seek election that they put themselves forward for scrutiny and challenge and so on. And I
Mhm.
think where we see democracies corroding and reversing, it's the lack of ability to do that. It's
Yeah.
people who are unable or unwilling to put themselves forward for criticism.
Mhm.
And that again is an instinct which we should be very concerned by and push against as far as is possible.
Mhm. So the Freedom of Thought report was completed its 12th edition, working, I guess Emma's were already working toward the 13th edition.
The work
Uh,
never stops.
yeah, exactly. It's a flagship document and report for Humanists International. What can people do to maintain vigilance over freedom of thought as a human right in their own respective country?
So, as I said, get involved with your national and local humanist organisation, organise a launch event, go and speak to your member of parliament or your representatives. Send them a copy of the report. The more voices that add, to the promotion of these issues, the better. Um, at an individual level, if people want to get involved directly, you can go on to the Freedom of Thought Report website, check out your country's edition. You'll see there's many options at the bottom of the page to send an update or a submission, or if you think we've got something wrong, you can add a correction. If you want to get involved in supporting it directly, you can go to Humanists International and sign up as a supporter and give us $5 a month or whatever you can afford. And the other sort of general call up in all seriousness is, we would love to be able to expand the resources available to this report. I mean, we have Emma, one person, working to coordinate this with help from other staff and volunteers, but you can imagine a team of 5, 10, 20 people working on this. And if you look at other similar reports around the human rights space, you'll see that they do have many more resources. So if anybody knows of research institutions, universities, funding agencies, governments, anybody who might be keen to become a partner or supporter of this report with us, please, please, please do get in touch with me or anybody, because we are always keen to give this report the resources that it deserves.
So certainly there are potential for financial support of various secular initiatives. I'll just put it that way, both in Canada and the United States as well. And there is an opportunity there in terms of future resources. I think certainly in Canada, having gone through the exercise of freedom of thought training last year for the report, I think that this establishes a good foundation for us to do ongoing monitoring on a regular basis, annually or something like that, on changes or progress achieved towards freedom of thought and expression in Canada. So
Wonderful.
we'll see what we can do with respect to that.
That's
So
great.
thank you very much, Gary, for this quick overview. Really, there's so much more in terms of the report. It's quite in depth and quite broad. Did you have any other final thoughts about the report?
No, no, I think it's been lovely to chat to you and explain some of the background to the report. And yeah, like I said, if anybody would like to get in touch, it's very easy to get in touch with us through the website with any questions or comments. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, great. Thanks again.
Thank you.